Hi everyone, in this video I'll be debriefing the motion that this house prefers a monarchy where the king has the divine right to rule as opposed to a theocracy ruled by religious institutions. In this video I'll try to quickly run through a few possible arguments that you could make both side proposition and opposition. So with that being said, let's jump into the framing for side proposition. So in side proposition, you have to understand that you have to agree that the monarch too derives his legitimacy of the divine right from a certain religion itself. But you could possibly argue that the monarchs, even with their divine rights, are still political rulers first, that they have a separate political identity and they do not have to follow religious rules as rigidly as theocrats who are bound to their religious texts. So with that being said, one of the possible arguments that you could make for side proposition is this argument about stability. So you could argue that in this debate that stability is one of the most important metrics because long-term stability and public buy-in is an important prerequisite for any government to implement policies for the long run. So the first level of analysis that you can run under this argument is that you could say that the public buy-in into the legitimacy of a ruler is higher in the case of a monarchy as opposed to a theocracy, because when you consider a theocracy, the way a theocracy looks like is you have a religious council at the top who will appoint a religious leader. So in most instances only a certain sect of a religion will be controlling this religious council. So the members of the public who are not part of the same sect, who might be of different sects within the same religion itself, might not buy into this government. They might view it as an illegitimate rule because they do not agree with the principles of this other sect. On the other hand, when you consider a monarchy, even if multiple sects of the same religion exist within a country, by virtue of the fact that they agree on the same god, there is a higher chance that they will buy into the legitimacy of the monarch just because of the fact that they agree on the same god and the same religion itself. Therefore they're more likely to believe in the legitimacy of this monarch's divine right to rule. So the second level of analysis that you could run under this argument is that you could say theocracies themselves have a chance of internal fragmentation, that due to the fact that there could be varying interpretations of scriptures within these theocracies as well. So like I told you previously, the way a theocracy looks like is there is a religious council and all of these scholars within the council themselves have to appoint the religious leaders. So this looks like a council of cardinals that has to appoint the pope, or the council of like religious scholars that appoint the supreme leader of Iran and things of that sort. So with that being said, so you could then expand on the impacts of this argument itself as to why long-term policy continuity is a very important thing for a country. So the second argument that I'd like to talk about is about why monarchs are most likely going to be more accountable than theocrats. So a few mechanisms under this argument. So the first mechanism that you could talk about is that you could say monarchs usually care about how history remembers them, because they oftentimes want to leave a sort of legacy behind because their name and dynasty are oftentimes associated with their rule. On the other hand, since theocrats have a stronger tie to their religion or stronger obligation to their religion, they are not personally tied to their rule. They rule in the name of their religion or god. So any failures that they have can oftentimes be blamed on divine will rather than their own personal incompetence. Whereas on the other hand, if monarchs take any sort of bad decisions, it oftentimes affects their legacy and they do not want that happening. So the second level of analysis that I'd like to talk about is under this argument is that about how monarchs depend on economic growth to sustain their rule, maintain control of the population by keeping them satisfied. On the other hand, theocrats oftentimes see economic success as secondary to their religious goals, because these theocrats often grow up in these religious monasteries, religious schools from a very young age, and they take any decisions through that lens itself. So afterwards, you can also talk about why this is why theocrats taking these sorts of religions is particularly bad, because if they do not care a lot about the economy, it can cause a lot of negative impacts for the people within the country itself, and you can talk about all of that. So the third mechanism that I like to talk about is that even in absolute monarchies, the king's powers are not entirely unchecked. They need the support of nobles, military leaders and advisors to sustain their power. So you can say that if these kings become like too ruthless or oppressive, these nobles and elites will keep them in check through either things like advisory pressure or things like passive resistance and things of that sort. Whereas, on the other hand, you can argue that religious leaders must always obey the religious council, the scriptures, meaning the power is like oftentimes centralized within these religious councils. And these religious councils are not necessarily democratic. These are oftentimes filled with like loyalists who want to like enforce religious scriptures. These might entail things such as the morality police that you see in countries like Iran and things of that sort. And the final level of analysis that I like to talk about under this argument is that you need to understand that both governance systems, the monarchy and the theocracy, need to pay at least a little bit of attention to public support, because in the instance that there is a high level of public dissatisfaction, this can cause revolts in like both sides. So underneath this, you can do the weighing that there is a high likelihood of leadership change in a monarchy, because a king, even though he has the divine right, is ultimately a mortal ruler with a divine right rather than a direct religious authority. This makes the chances of overthrowing a king significantly higher compared to a theocrat, in the case that the king ruler is like sort of bad, takes a lot of bad decisions. On the other hand, overthrowing a theocrat is like far more difficult and dangerous, because attacking theocrats themselves means that it is oftentimes perceived as a direct attack on the religious leader itself, rather than on a political leader who is like a mere mortal. So you can argue that the tipping point for rebellion against a bad theocrat is much higher as opposed to the tipping point against a bad monarch. So that is another argument that you can run for side proposition. So the third argument that I like to talk about on the side proposition is about how personal freedoms are oftentimes affected within these governments. So underneath this argument, you could talk about the fact that the simple incentive of any monarch is to simply tax people for their own gain. So as long as people keep on paying their taxes, these monarchies will tolerate these people irrespective of their identities, their religions, and things of that sort. On the other hand, the theocracies have oftentimes derive their legitimacy from the religion itself. Therefore, because of this fact, these theocracies are more likely to demonize and discriminate non-believers and believers of the same religion from other sects as well. This can result in things like persecutions, forced conversions for people from religious minorities. And you could also talk about the fact that theocracies oftentimes criminalize certain behaviors that are deemed immoral by religious law. For example, what you see in countries like Iran, where you see the morality police implementing certain laws and things of that sort. And underneath this argument, you can do a bit of weighing to prove that how, in the worst case, in a substandard average life in a monarchy is more often better than being an oppressed minority in one of these theocracies. So now, moving on into the arguments that you could make for side opposition. But before I move on into the arguments, you need to sort of characterize or give a few examples as to how these theocracies look like. So a few examples could possibly be about how like the Pope rules for life after he's elected by the College of Cardinals, or how the Supreme Leader of Iran serves for life after he's like appointed by the Assembly of Experts, which consists of like religious leaders and religious scholars. So the first argument that I like to talk about is this argument about accountability. So you could argue that theocracies oftentimes offer more accountability because there is a high likelihood that the clergy who are these religious councils can rise through the ranks from the grassroots of society. And you could argue that these people who rise through the ranks are oftentimes more proximate to people's issues than a monarch who grew up sheltered in his palace like his entire life. And you can then talk about the sort of like decisions that this can lead to. And the second level of analysis that you could talk about under this argument is that you could say, when you consider these theocrats who are chosen by these religious councils, these people are not like the chosen one, the top theocrat is not like the chosen one with a divine right. He is instead seen to be as the first among equals within these religious councils itself. So any decisions that they make, they oftentimes discuss it with their religious councils and make the decision, and thereby you can argue that this really reduces the likelihood of like bad decisions. So with that being said, the second argument that I'd like to talk about side opposition is that about how theocracies have greater stability than monarchies. Underneath this, you could argue that theocratic governance is like more stable than a monarchy, because religious councils oftentimes act as a safeguard against poor leadership. If the leader makes like destructive decisions, the council can like intervene and remove them before they like sort of drive the nation to collapse. On the other hand, you do not sort of like have this checking mechanism when it comes to a monarch, and you could oftentimes argue by the time this monarch has like been removed after a revolt or whatnot, the situation of the country is like really bad, and it's like really tough to like rebuild it up afterwards. Yeah. And to sort of like supplement this, you can also talk about how tyrannical kings oftentimes have like very few internal checks and balances of power, and even if an aristocracy exists, because this person is deemed to have the divine right to rule, and since they have like absolute power, they can sort of like eliminate any opposition that they have within the aristocracy itself. Whereas on the other hand, religious leaders cannot like execute members of the clergy itself, because like I told you, they're not seen as a chosen one, they're seen as like first among equals. And even if and thereby on the worst case, even if like internal power struggles exist, they're less likely to be very violent and destabilizing to the extent of a monarchy. So with that being said, the third argument that I'd like to talk about for side opposition is that you could talk about how there is like a higher likelihood of war when it comes to theocracy, a monarchy. So underneath this, you could argue about the fact that theocracies are less likely to like engage in like reckless military expansion, because oftentimes their legitimacy is dependent on things like upholding their doctrine, as opposed to the incentives of kings. Oftentimes kings have like other incentives, like their incentive to like gain glory, gain power, and also to like distract their populations from issues in their own kingdoms by engaging in things like war. So because of that, you can argue that there is a higher likelihood of war, higher likelihood of like waging war on like other nations in a monarchy. And afterwards, you could also possibly talk about the negative impacts that wars usually have on the economy of the country itself, and you can like sort of impact it to a higher level. So those are the arguments that I have for both side proposition and opposition. Please keep in mind that these are not the only arguments that you can run for both sides. There might be a lot of other possible arguments as well, but for the sake of like keeping this video within time, I've tried to explain as much as possible within these arguments.